All right, good afternoon. Welcome to this very special occasion of the IDS Seers, Singer and Jolly Lecture on Leadership and Development. I'm Peter Taylor and I'm Director of Research here at IDS. And it's great to see so many of our students, as well as former and present staff members of IDS here together. And welcome also to all those who are joining online, including alumni and other participants. So first, a word about this lecture itself. Dudley Seers, Sir Hans Singer and Sir Richard Jolly have, through their demonstrated personal values and commitment and through their enormous intellectual contributions, been really instrumental to the growth of IDS since we were formed in 1966. And they played a critical role in the emergence of understandings, policy and practices in the broad domain of international development and in development studies. And I know we're going to hear more about their respective examples of leadership through the presentation by Roy that will follow shortly. I'd just like to stress that this lecture, organized by IDS, is one way to honor the huge contributions that they have all made and continue to make by influencing multiple generations of those engaged in development studies. And we're, of course, absolutely delighted to have Sir Richard Jolly with us in person here today. And we're very privileged today to have as our speaker in this lecture, Roy Trivedy. And Roy graduated with his MPhil in development from IDS in 1986, just yesterday, really. Yeah. He has over 30 years of international development experience, working in a variety of managerial and advisory roles for government and NGOs in Southern and Eastern Africa, South Asia, and in the UK. And most recently, he was employed as an international civil servant for the United Nations. He is passionate about development and making a difference in the world, as I'm sure you're going to hear very shortly. Now, I'm sure many of you here today are also thinking about your own career pathways. Perhaps for some, it's a little more in the past. For some, it may be well in the future and in the present. And Roy is just one example of a leader who is officially retired, but remains incredibly active in this field. So, for example, Roy recently undertook work with UNESCO to write the 10-year review of the Samoa pathway. And I'm sure that Roy's work is going to be continued, which is immensely valuable for all of us, given his wealth of knowledge and experience. Now, I know, having had a little preview of what Roy is going to talk about, that he's going to share many insights from his own pathway, during which he's provided exemplary leadership over the years. And I think this topic of leadership and development is hugely important for us here at IDS. And in rather classic IDS style, it also leads immediately to us questioning what we mean by leadership and development. Well, development is, of course, a highly contested concept. And here at IDS, we're actively engaged in many debates within the Institute, but also nationally here in the UK and internationally on what development could and should entail in the future. For example, through our conversations on recasting development and decolonization and our perspectives on progress towards the SDGs and beyond, and many more. Now, those debates will not be surprising. They're part of IDS's DNA, as I know Roy will speak more about shortly. But there are also other really important considerations for our understandings of concepts and practices of leadership, again, in relation to much of IDS's work around governance, power, participation, and gender, and many other areas. And in an era where we may feel we need more and better examples of inclusive, engaged, and progressive leadership worldwide, this feels an important moment to have this conversation. So, Roy, it's great to have you with us today, and welcome. You're going to speak for around 30 minutes, I think. Then I'll have a chance to pose a few questions to you directly. Then we'll open up for questions and comments, so get your active listening going. And then finally, we'll end up with a short video about our graduate scholarship program. So I think it's going to be a really exciting and I think inspirational session. Without further ado, Roy, over to you. And welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter. If you don't mind, I'll stand over there and look forward to this. So, firstly, it's really a great honor to be invited here today to deliver this lecture. Dudley Seers, Sir Hans Singer, and Sir Richard Jolly all made huge contributions, as Peter said, to international development. They shaped the work of this institute, but they also influenced researchers, planners, policymakers, and practitioners worldwide. Okay, so we are really, it's amazing to have Sir Richard Jolly here and to also remember Sir Hans and Dudley Seers today. In my presentation today, I'll talk about some of the work that I've been involved with since completing my MPhil course here at the Institute in 84-86. And this is especially for the current set of students, many of whom I know may be wondering about what kind of career paths will they have after they finish IDS. I'll also talk about some of the things I learned about leadership in development and some of the people that I learned from and some of the challenges that I faced personally in the work that I did. In the questions after the presentation, I hope that we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of the major global development and leadership challenges that the world faces right now, such as, of course, climate change, the climate crisis, migration and displacement, the loss of biodiversity worldwide, the need to increase investments in clean technology and adjust our lifestyles, particularly in the northern industrialized countries, to embrace non-oil growth, the challenges posed by ongoing conflicts and wars, the frequency and severity of natural disasters, the growing levels of inequality and vulnerability in many parts of the world, challenges of multilateralism faces, and the fact that the world is substantively off track on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. And many other challenges, of course. And when you think about all of these challenges, you begin to perhaps question some of the value of what we've learned in international development and advocated for in international development over the past few decades. My personal view, however, is that these global and national development challenges reinforce the need for development studies, which has an important role to play now in creating a more equitable and more sustainable world for all, just as it did when IDS was first established in 1966. It's perhaps worth considering, however, for the Institute, whether we should organize a deeper discussion, a set of workshops about the relevance of development studies and the need for global leadership in the run-up to the 60th anniversary of the Institute in a couple of years. Before proceeding with my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Institute, and especially the three leading development leaders which this event is named after. Dudley Seers, for those who aren't aware, right, died in 1983, the year before I came to IDS. But I remember at the time, in 1984, there were many, many frequent tributes to Dudley Seers during that period. IDS was founded in 1966 and was Britain's first National Institute of Development Studies. It sought to combine interdisciplinary research and teaching and provide what was called at the time a central training institute for administrators in developing countries. Dudley Seers had previously worked as Director General in the Ministry of Overseas Development led by Minister Barbara Castle in 1964 in the UK. Dudley Seers was the director of IDS from 1967 to 72. And in Richard's excellent short history of IDS, a personal reflection, which was published for the 40th anniversary of the Institute, and also in Hans Singer's account of the early years of IDS, which was published as part of the Silver Jubilee annual report 1990, they beautifully capture some of the mood of the time, the social, economic, political mood of that post-colonial early independence period for many parts of the world. Dudley Seers was a renowned development economist and leader who set the stage for rethinking development planning and reconceptualizing development to include education and well-being of people, not just to focus on economic growth of nations. And in in Richard Jolly's and Hans Singer's account of this, you will also find when you read that, Dudley Seers was always self-critical of everything that he did, but he also always strived to do better and always was a huge champion and fiercely protective of IDS. And that's something that I think all of us who have studied here have also tried to keep. In 84, 86, when I was here, when I was a student here, we'd regularly see Hans Singer at the Institute. Professor Hans Singer was a German-born development economist who was best known for the Singer-Prebisch thesis, which demonstrates that the terms of trade consistently move against primary producers. He showed how poorer nations that produce primary products and export raw materials and agricultural products, etc., lose from the terms of trade when exchanging their products for manufactured goods from richer industrialized countries. One of the things that I remember most about Professor Singer was that throughout the period that we were here studying, Hans Singer would be seen constantly working on the thesis and looking at the terms of trade issue, different countries and regions and so on. And one of the remarkable things about him was that he was incredibly approachable. If anybody went and talked to him, particularly about terms of trade, Hans would love that over a coffee and so on. So he was a really brilliant person to have around. So Richard was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations from 1982 to 1995. He was also Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, and from 1996 to 2000 was the Special Advisor to the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, and the Principal Coordinator of UNDP's Human Development Report. That Human Development Report nowadays is one of the critical reports that all of us in development look to every year to say, what are some of the trends and so on. Richard was one of those authors of that report. And it's a fantastic, it's a fantastic testimony to some of the work that he's done. He co-authored the influential book, Adjustment with a Human Face, Protecting the Vulnerable and Promoting Growth, at a time when the IMF and many donors were advocating severe, austere economic adjustment policies in many poorer countries. So Richard Jolly was named as one of the 50 distinguished thinkers globally on economics. So we're sitting with, somebody who is so prominent and who has had huge influence, not just on the work of the Institute, but on development thinking worldwide. And it's incredible, Richard. Thank you for your amazing contribution. All of these three people are really prominent intellectual giants. They've influenced development policy and practice worldwide. At IDS, we've also had many other distinguished development researchers, thinkers, leaders, and practitioners. Sadly, this year, we lost one of our well-known development specialists, Professor Michael Lipton. Michael Lipton specialized in the study of rural poverty, land reform, urban bias, and the ultra-poor. Michael and his partner Merle Lipton were at IDS in the 1980s when I studied here, and both were known for their academic rigor, concise and clear thinking. In Michael's presence, if you asked a question, you'd have to think several times before, am I getting this right or not? But he was a brilliant, brilliant teacher and a really brilliant development practitioner. We've also been fortunate at IDS to have many other prominent development teachers and practitioners. Robert Chambers, Kate Young, Carlos Fortin, Emmanuel Decat, who is also with us this evening, Stephanie Griffith-Jones, Barbara Harris, Nyla Kabir, Reg Green, Ed Clay, Gordon White, Manfred Beanfield, Rafi Kaplinsky, Robin Murray, Chris Colclough, Charles Harvey, Robert Wade, Jeremy Swift, Simon Maxwell, Mick Moore, Susanna Davis, Anne-Marie Goetz, Stefan Durkin, and the list can go on and on and on. If you look up some of the people who have taught and studied and so on at IDS, you'll see an incredible line of development thinkers, people who have led thinking in development on a whole range of things. And so, you know, it's quite an amazing place. And I'd especially like to this evening to also mention our director, Melissa Leach. Okay, Melissa, for a superb service over the past decade and her inspirational leadership. Under Melissa's leadership, I think all of us know that IDS has ranked first in the world, in the QS World University rankings for development studies in the past 5 years. That is an incredible, incredible feat. Okay, it really is amazing. Thank you, Melissa, for your amazing service. Before moving on with my presentation, I'd like to just say a few words also about some of the students who have studied here. And many of them have gone on to do incredible things in development, in leadership, and so on. This evening, I'd like to especially remember our colleagues who are currently serving in Palestine and in Israel and in all of the conflict zones around the world. One of the people, I'm not sure if everybody knows this, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian state actually studied here, Mohammed Shatia. He studied here, did his doctorate here in 1989, and you just have to think about the kinds of challenges that he and everybody else in that really difficult place at the moment are having to go through. Okay, and it's really worth remembering that IDS actually has pioneered a lot of these people's development, and these are champions for peace and for a better world for all. Let me turn now briefly to my own experience. So my interest in development began actually in Kenya, where I was born. Okay, I'm the youngest in a family of 6 children. My parents emigrated from Gujarat in the west of India to East Africa in the 1930s. My grandfather was employed on the East African railways. And later, my father, who was an accountant, and my mother in Kenya, who was working at home, was both providing childcare, looking after the family. We weren't very economically well off. We left Kenya in 1968 when dual nationals were given a 3-month deadline to decide whether they would become Kenyan or British nationals. I was 9 when I arrived in the UK and my family arrived with just a few bags of belongings. And after our first year living in London, my father secured a job as an accountant in Hertfordshire, and I went to school there. I later went to study law at Sheffield University for my first degree. Quite early on, when I was studying in my first degree, I decided I didn't want to become a lawyer, go into the legal profession. And after completing my degree, I worked in London at a hostel for young homeless people for 2 years. I was then selected to go and work for the United Nations Association as a community worker in Cape Verde. And that was in 1981. When I handed in my resignation. When I left that job, UNA phoned me just before Christmas 1981. And a few weeks before, they said, "We're really sorry, but the project you were going to work for has now folded. We'll try and find you another job, but in the meantime, you try and do whatever you can." Fortunately, a month later, I was able to get another job as a caseworker with the British Refugee Council, and I worked there for 2 years. And it was there that I was advised by the project leader to apply for the MPhil course in development studies at IDS. So the IDS course we were on, the MP9 course, we had approximately 20 students on the MP9 course from different backgrounds and countries. The course directors were Mick Moore and Robin Luckham, and they were supported by an excellent administrator, course administrator, Alison Tesfashu, and backed by other brilliant support staff, including Sheila, who was for many years in reception here, Beverly, who occasionally still works here. Richard Longhurst was also one of our amazing teachers during that period. Richard, lovely to see you again as well. And I was fortunate to have Robert Chambers as my supervisor for my thesis, and Robert was just brilliant. At that time, IDS didn't have so many students as it does now. There were the MPhil students, the DPhil students, and a range of fellows, associates, visiting lecturers and staff, all of whom combined multidisciplinary research, teaching and support services. And I remember attending many lectures and presentations in rooms 121 and 221, which was really famous, and they would be packed. And you would go and listen to people and you'd think, wow, how did they get all this knowledge and experience from all over the world? And it was a really great time to be here. For me, IDS sharpened my interest in development and post-colonialism. And I was especially interested in different development theories and how they would be put into practice. That was the thing that really drove me. And I was always keen to learn about different country contexts, and especially about the role of the state in providing and improving people's lives. And one of the things that I learned from my MPhil course was also the differential impact of different types of development policies on people depending on their own situations, whether they were rural, whether they lived in rural areas or urban areas, whether they were women or men, people with disabilities, etc. And I was really interested to understand some of those things. It also gave me the confidence to learn from different situations and disciplines, and to ask questions about economic and social policies and express my own views publicly. Almost 40 years later, it's amazing to think that many of the students from that MP9 course remain good friends. We meet regularly, almost every year. This year we met for 2 weeks. We had a holiday in Scotland, where I live, and also in Northumberland. We got together, we talked about IDS, we talked about all the things that people have gone on to do, amazing things. And all of my colleagues have worked in developing in one way or other, either in local development, in national, or at global or regional level. Sadly, we lost two of our brightest talents from our year. Adrian Fernando, who was an economist and worked with the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua after leaving IDS, and later as a chief executive of a global natural gas company. Adrian was a fantastic student, somebody who would always share. Whatever he learned, he would be willing to share. And he's a really brilliant friend. He died a few years ago of pancreatic cancer. Also, we lost another of our leading stars, who was Professor Jude Howell. Jude taught international development at the London School of Economics and for a time at IDS. Jude was a specialist on China and the labor movement, civil society. She was an amazing linguist, a musician, also sadly lost to cancer. So unfortunately, those two colleagues have passed away, but the rest all went on to work in international development in one way or other, serving their own countries or serving at a global stage. During that period of doing the MPhil, we didn't have a lot of career guidance. And when we were student IDS, and maybe part of that was to do with the fact that many of the students from overseas had jobs to go back to. I remember at the time, the last few months before completing my MPhil thesis, etc., I was also starting to get a bit anxious about what kind of work would I go on to do. And fortunately, in the summer of 1986, I'd seen an advert in the New Internationalist for somebody to come and work in a project for 6 to 9 months with the Indian Tribal Women's Trust. And the work involved supporting the only tribal women's milk cooperative in South Gujarat that still exists today. The women were landless and were assisted to take a government loan to buy a buffalo. And the buffaloes would then be impregnated. And once they produced milk, part of the milk would be sold to a dairy. And gradually, through those payments, each month women would get a payment for how much milk had been produced. And gradually you would pay back the loan for the buffalo, and then they would have an asset. And that would help them to rebuild their lives and so on. The project was based in a remote area. And when I prepared this, I was thinking to myself, I wrote this down, and then I thought, many of the students today probably won't understand when I say this. Remote in those days, of course, we didn't have any mobile phones. There was no internet. If you were unlucky as I was, there was no flight path over. So you would be stuck in a forest somewhere. You would rarely see any planes or trains, or you would be far away from an urban area or even a village, etc. And it was really remote. And I remember just before I went out to work in this project, my mother had visited Ahmedabad, which is the capital of Gujarat. And with a few relatives, they'd hired a minibus and taken a ride from the capital of Gujarat down to this project area. It took them 10 hours to get to this project area. And when they got there in the evening, the two project coordinators, Mira and Suresh, were sitting there. There was no electricity, there was no lighting. They were sitting there in the dark with just a snake pit around them. And one of my aunts said to my mother, "Oh my goodness, surely your son can get a job somewhere which is a bit more comfortable than this." So my mum came back and told me this, but I'd already set my heart on going out to that project. So my task was to support the management of the cooperative, to help increase the milk production, etc. I had a bicycle and 17 villages to cover. And one of the tasks that I was assigned was to set up a new 10-hectare irrigated fodder farm. So I had to get the land leveled, arrange irrigation, decide what to plant. And then with the first cutting, we fed the buffaloes, and amazingly, gradually the milk yields would increase. And so women were able to pay off their loans quicker. And it was there that I learned really about community development in these kind of areas and so on. I learned about how difficult it was to get the district veterinary officer, whose job it was to come and support our cooperative, etc., to come to our area. So that person would be maybe 40 kilometers away. To be able to get to him before, what you'd have to do was to drive there on a motorcycle. You'd leave the project area at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, get there before 6 o'clock, and when the person was getting up, doing his puja and his prayers in the morning, you'd have to get him out of bed and say, "Please, Sahib, would you come to our area, because we need some veterinary support." And you'd have to entice him with incentives and so on. So I learned a lot about how you work with some of the district officials and so on. One of the other things I learned from this was never to be frightened to ask people about how to do something that you're unsure about. When you ask people about, their support, how to do things, etc., people often take a greater interest in what you're trying to achieve and often support you with their own efforts. So I learned that it's possible also to make a difference and contribute to improving people's lives, not just by using finance and resources, but through your knowledge, through your networks, through your personal attitudes and behavior, which would be watched for by people. And also sometimes just through your solidarity with people's lives. And you could improve just by help people in those ways. After 9 months working in India, I returned to the UK and soon was encouraged by my partner at the time, my wife, since then to apply for a job as a development advisor working with Oxfam in Malawi. So Malawi at that period was ruled by the first president, Dr. Kamuzu Banda. And President Banda was still in power at that time. The country was largely dependent on exports of tea and tobacco and so on. It had significant levels of poverty, and the ruling Malawi Congress Party, fearing a rebellion, had resorted to using their young pioneers to intimidate any opposition movements, etc. So it was also at that point housing 640,000 Mozambican refugees who had fled the war from Mozambique. And people were genuinely scared to speak out during that period because of fear of being killed, ending up in jail, or being accused of witchcraft or sorcery. So people were really scared, and Oxfam had advertised this job to try and say, we want to do a piece of research looking at people's lives in Malawi, and then we want you to publish that to say, okay, what should we be doing as an organization in Malawi? So I prepared for that interview by talking to somebody else who was a regular visitor at IDS during that period, a person called Jonathan Kidd, who was working at Y College during that period. And Jonathan is a leading expert on Malawi and so on. So I went and talked to him and so on. I was also fortunate because at that point, I had a sister and a brother-in-law who worked at the university in Malawi for 14 years. So I kind of knew a little bit about the country and so on. I was amazed to get the job though. And so I had 18 months to train a group of researchers to complete fieldwork in 6 locations in Malawi, share the findings through workshops, write up the findings, ensure that there was a follow-up plan and so on. And after the experience in India, this was in one way a luxury because I had a 4-wheel drive vehicle and I could travel anywhere, etc. But in that 18 months that I was there, the 1 year which I had this 4-wheel drive vehicle, I did 27,000 miles on very, very ropey roads, I would say. So I became it was exhausting actually. Anyway, the good thing was I had an amazing team of people from Lusaka in Zambia and also from Oxford to support me and so on. We wrote that work up, and just before we were about to publish it, I was summoned to State House by President Banda. And I went there and they said to me, President said, young man, I understand you've done some research that the title of your book that is going to be published has got the title Poverty in it. Young man, I want you to know that there is no such thing as poverty in my country. It was a little bit daunting to be standing in front of the president. Of course, I said, well, Mr. President, this is what people have said to us, but of course, if you insist, we will take that. We will change the title of the book. It was more important for Oxfam to be able to support people in the country rather than insisting on, keeping that title. So anyway, that was published and so on. And later from that experience, I came back. I worked in Oxfam House in Oxford for 2 years as a research assistant, working on aid policies, official aid policies, projects that were badly designed. So things like large dams, like different types of infrastructure projects and so on. And then we would use that. I would research, and then Oxfam would lobby and campaign based on those things. So I learned a lot from colleagues in Oxfam House and so on. Learned a lot about campaigning and advocacy work and so on. And I would happily have stayed in Oxfam, actually, because it was a really brilliant time. But at that point, my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, was living in London. So I had to try and look for jobs in London. So my next job was working as the development advisor for the Labour Party. And this was 1990. And I worked as part of the Labour's Foreign Affairs team. led by Gerald Kaufman, George Robertson, who was later NATO Secretary General, George Fuchs, who's now in the Lords, and the development team led by Anne Clwyd, who sadly died earlier this year as well, and Dale Campbell-Savers. I learned a lot about working with UK politicians, with the European Union, politicians in the European Union, and so on. I also learned during that period, one of the things we did was organize a summer school for UK political leaders here at the IDS, and a number of prominent politicians came here for 3-4 days. It was during that period when John Toy, Professor John Toy, was here, and so on. And it was a fantastic, introduction for many of them into international development. One of the experiences I had at that time, however, which stayed with me for life and leadership, actually, was the period when Nelson Mandela visited the UK Parliament in 1991. So many of us had campaigned for anti-apartheid and so on. And of course, in the Parliament, there were also people who campaigned against the ANC. But of course, when Mandela visited 1991, the Parliament House was full, 650 plus MPs, all the researchers, myself as a junior researcher and so on. And we all stood in awe as Nelson Mandela walked in. And the thing that stayed with me, you know what Mandela did? He walked in with, of course, his entourage. And the first thing he did, he went to the side where there was a lady serving tea and coffee. And he said, and he spoke to her. And of course, everybody is wondering, all these amazing politicians in the UK, politicians who all want to meet this guy. And he goes first to the tea lady. And so, of course, immediately after, he gets chaperoned round to meet all the dignitaries and so on. And so I went straight to the tea lady and I said, what did he say to you? She said, and this stayed with me for my life. He said, you know what? I've been working in this place for 25 years. Not a single bugger, she used the word, I'm sorry to say, has ever asked me my name, where I'm from, what do my family do, etc. Imagine how you feel when this tall African leader comes in and he comes to me first and I serve him tea and he says, Madam, what is your name? Where is your family from? And it taught me something about leadership that always stayed with me. The importance of being humble, being accessible, and so on. And for that lady, no matter what Mandela went on to do after that, she would be a lifelong supporter. Yeah. Okay? And it's something that always stayed with me and really just so moving to see it. I also met Mandela during that period, and it was just quite humbling. Such a brilliant, brilliant person and a leader. Unfortunately, of course, Labour lost the 92 election, and this meant another 4 to 5 years in opposition. But one of the things that myself and Anne Clwyd's researcher, Caroline Ashley, did was we wrote the 1992 Labour Party Manifesto for International Development. I've got some of the things, I just brought them to show you. This was the work on poverty in Malawi. This was the book that we published, the pamphlet, A World of Difference, Labour's Programme on Aid and Development, 1992, which, of course, unfortunately, because we lost the election, we weren't able to implement. But we were really pleased to lay out what would Labour's policy be, how would it be different from the previous government, etc. And unfortunately, it didn't get used then, but it did get used in 1997. Exactly that, what we'd written, got implemented. My next 2 posts were with Save the Children. So after Labour lost the 92 election, the party had to make a lot of cuts, particularly on international policy and so on. And one of the things I got was tasked to do at the end of 92 was a piece of work for the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. And I was sent to South Asia, India, Pakistan and Nepal to meet political leaders there. So I did a 3-month piece of work. I visited all of those nations. And while I was there, I just thought, I really want to come and work in South Asia again. And so after the Labour Party, I applied for a job with Save the Children as a program director in India. And I worked there for 4 years, and later on to Mozambique, where I also did the same job. In India, I was responsible for managing a very large dispersed team. Okay, and in working in 13 states, a major part of my work focused on developing a new country strategy for India, for Save the Children, and then implementing that strategy. And one of the things I realized, developing a strategy for India is pretty difficult when you only have £5 million or whatever as program funds, etc. But even more difficult was managing the relationships with partners and the staff and with government to make the change. So developing a strategy is difficult, but more difficult is the task of actually implementing a strategy, because inevitably when you implement a strategy, you have to decide what you're not going to do. And there will be losers from that. And one of the tasks was how you manage those people to bring them on side to say, yeah, okay, you're doing the right thing. We may not be benefiting, but the country as a whole is benefiting. But I have to say that I worked really hard during that period and really enjoyed it. And I learned lots of things about myself, about managing relationships and so on. In Mozambique too, I was tasked with developing a new strategy for the country. And one of the interesting things there was that we had to work in Portuguese. And working in a different language is an incredible leveler. So, you know, we at IDS, many of us work in English all the time. And we think, you know, when you go to places, you can use all your, you know, amazing language skills, etc. But when you have to work in a different language and you have to use it daily, it's a really brilliant leveler. And it makes you learn things from people perhaps who are not, you know, not in the same positions as you and so on. So I encourage everybody, while you're doing your IDS course, also try and invest in learning other languages and so on. So I was there in Mozambique during the floods in 2000, and I also was there for a lot of the other managing the Save the Children program. During that period, I was beginning to think, well, I really need a change now. I've done this for 8 years. And fortunately, in 97, the Labour Party had been elected into government, and it was the first Blair period, etc. Claire Short was our minister, and Claire Short visited Mozambique during that period. I didn't tell anybody that I knew Claire Short. I traveled with her and so on. But when she came, she said to me at the end of an evening at a reception, she said, you should come and work in my department now. And so I managed to get a secondment from Save the Children into the UK civil service, into DFID, and I worked there. And my first job in DFID was working on what's called the conflict prevention pool. I was there as a conflict advisor working in, at that point, we had the Great Lakes region, which was really difficult. We also had parts of West Africa, of course, Sierra Leone was starting to resurface, parts of Nigeria, Jos, where I visited and so on. So there was a lot of work, particularly in Africa and so on. And I was responsible for developing some of the work around DFID's work with the Foreign Office and also the Ministry of Defence on how could the UK government use not only development policy, but also diplomacy and Ministry of Defence assets to try and prevent conflicts and promote peace. So I did that for a few years. Later, I went on to manage the Central Asia, South Caucasus program, working in Russian, in some of those countries, which the former Soviet Union countries, which was also quite challenging. In 2006, I became a senior civil servant and was deputy head and then head of DFID Tanzania when we were providing £120 million a year of budget support to the government of Tanzania. And that in itself was incredible responsibilities and so on. Later, I went on to become the head of civil society department with a budget of £200 million a year, managing DFID and the UK's relations with all civil society organizations worldwide. And I was also the team leader for the last white paper. There is a new white paper being published on international development now, but the last white paper was published in 2009, and that was this paper, and it was really about multilateralism. And many of the things that we've seen subsequently around climate change, the issue of the pandemic, and so on. By 2000, so in the 13 years that I was a UK civil servant, I worked with 6 different ministers, junior ministers, and so on, permanent secretaries. I learned lots of things. I learned from Claire Short about the importance of understanding history in development and seeing the bigger picture. It wasn't just about doing lots of aid projects, but really about bringing about real long-term change in people's lives. I learned from Claire Short about the importance of discretionary effort. Okay, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a second. I learned from Hilary Benn and Baroness Valerie Amos on the importance of building coalitions, that you could not do everything yourselves. You needed to build coalitions for change, to build state capability, and the importance of rules-based institutions. I learned from Douglas Alexander the importance of development results and positioning the UK in key institutions. I also learned from Conservative ministers Andrew Mitchell and Alan Duncan on why value for money is important, why it matters, and communicating concisely with the public. I learned from Justine Greening, who was another minister, on why investment in women and girls is vital for development. And most of all, I learned as a civil servant the importance of the civil service and what a good civil servant, in my view, should be, how it can support, how they can help support their ministers and governments to make choices. I left DFID in 2013, end of 2013, to take on the role with the UN. So for many years in the bilateral space from DFID, we were quite critical of the UN system. You know, the UN was a big amorphous thing. We were quite critical of all these different parts of the UN system. And the UN had advertised for new resident coordinators. And so I had to go through an internal competition within the UN, within the UK civil service, to put my name forward, and then an external assessment center to become a resident coordinator for the UN system. And I applied and was given a ticket to become a resident coordinator, which is responsible for the UN's operations in a country. So you're responsible as a resident coordinator for all the UN agencies that work in that country and so on. And you're the first person that is called when a government wants to ask questions of the UN or is thinking about certain things within the UN. So I took on that role first in Papua New Guinea, which was a difficult place to work, and where I had to relearn some of the things that I'd learned at IDS, because in Papua New Guinea, it's not always the state that is the critical provider of services. It's actually local government. People's allegiance is often to their own clan and to their own area rather than to the Papua New Guinean state. And the reasons for that are to do with history, to do with the way in which the state often hands out licenses for mining and so on, where people feel that they themselves, local people, feel that they don't benefit from those. So there is that. But I really loved the work with the UN. I learned about the convening power of the United Nations. And one of the tasks that I was given was to rebuild a much more cohesive UN system with a stronger offer to government. So each of these governments that you're serving are member states of the UN. And what you want to do is, as the United Nations, be the first person to be able to advise governments about choices they're making, and also ideally be the first person that the government ministers would call when they need advice. Unfortunately, when I started, the UN reputation in Papua New Guinea was not very good. And so we had to rebuild that with government, build a stronger, cohesive UN system with a clearer strategy of what we were going to do, and then try and build that link with government and partners and so on. The other thing we had to do was also the single largest conflict in the Pacific has been the Bougainville crisis, where more than 10,000 people died. And I was asked to support restarting of the Bougainville peace process in that region and so on, and we were able to do some of that. Later, after 4 years serving there, I moved to work in Timor-Leste, which is a younger nation with its own incredible history of, for development and so on. And I worked there as a resident coordinator. In Timor-Leste, I would say the UN had a much stronger, relatively cohesive offer to government, but we worked on that, continued to work on that and make that stronger. And I also worked with the Timor-Leste government to support them during the COVID pandemic and also the floods of 2021. So a few things very quickly, okay? And I know I've spoken for too long, Peter, and I will finish quite quickly. A few things that I learned along the way, particularly for people who are students here. One, really important, if this is the only takeaway you have from this, please listen now, okay? Enjoy your work. Every place you serve, you have to learn something that you love about the country, the place where you're serving, the institution that you're working for, okay? And you have to really cherish that. Because if you love the places that you work is no longer a chore. It becomes like something you really enjoy and so on. And I've been really lucky. Every country I've worked in, I've found something that I just love about that country, the people of those countries and so on. Secondly, whatever you can make a difference. Doesn't matter, you can be just one person, part of a smaller grouping, you can be a major policy institute, a government, etc. You can make a difference. Your behavior, your attitudes, etc. can help. People are always observing you and so on, and you can make a change. A couple of other things. First, that strategies are good, but you also need to be aware. I've constantly been asked, every single place, can you develop a strategy for our work here? And you have to remember that people lose out from strategies because you have to learn to do things and you have to learn not to stop doing other things. And also that you need people around you to implement a strategy. So don't always just think that you can do it yourself. Build teams around you, people who can support you, who can do the things that you're less good at, and so on. It doesn't mean that you just leave all those things to them. You have to keep working on the things that you're not so good at, to keep building and continuously learn. But don't be over self-critical. Don't have too much doubt. Go with confidence. Ask people if you're unsure. Next thing I learned was understanding myself. What are the things that I think I'm good at? What are the things that I'm less good at? How do I work with that? What's my preferred learning style? And one of the things that I learned was I like to always know the theory of something. And then I like to know, okay, how is this theory going to be put into practice? That's what spurs me on. But people learn in different ways. Some people learn through practice, some people learn in other ways. And you have to know your own learning style and preference, and also the people around you. What are they good at? What are the things that they like to learn? Third thing, learning about institutions. Forming alliances and partnerships is critical. No institution in the world can do any things by themselves. Institutions are all imperfect. Try to use and work with the institution, respect the institution you work for, but also don't think that that's the only way of doing things. Try and stay open. Keep your mind open to other ways of doing things and so on. Final two things is leading teams, okay? Context. One of the things that IDS teaches you, it taught me, was context really matters. Try to understand what is the context here? What are people struggling with? Which people are they? How can you help them, etc.? And this thing that I came back to with Claire Short about discretionary effort, Claire had this amazing, she had a long table in which maybe about 20 people could sit on a table. And one of the things she used to do as a civil servant, Paul Wafer, my colleague from DFID, former colleague from DFID is here. Claire had this long table where if you put a submission up to say, Minister, we have to think about this, you might want to think about policy X or Y, she would invite everybody who's working on that issue on that table. And even if you were the most junior person, maybe the person doing the photocopying or whatever, you would be invited to that table. And the first thing Claire would do would say, oh, what do you do in my department? What's your name? And that built something called discretionary effort. So if Claire Short ever phoned you in the middle of the night, you would get up and do what she wanted, not because she was your minister, but because you respected her. And that kind of discretionary effort is something that we can all learn from and build. Final thing, I learned from Suma Chakrabarti, our permanent secretary at DFID. Suma taught many things to all of the civil servants, including myself and so on. One of the things he said, which always struck me as being very important, he said, you know, communication really matters. Communication in verbal communication, written communication, etc. And when you're under pressure, which at certain times in your career, you will be under pressure, actually what you need to do is communicate more, not less. It was a fantastic piece of advice, very simple in one way, but actually what happens is when we're all under pressure, what happens is generally we all go into our shells. And Suma was saying, you actually need to do the opposite. And that was something that struck with me. So, Peter, I've talked for more than my 30 minutes, I know that. I hope that some of what I've said makes some sense to colleagues and to the audience and so on. I want to say finally just, how pleased I am to be back at IDS. I am mentoring with Michelle's support and the team here's support. I'm mentoring students and so on because I believe that it's the right thing to do. And I believe that there's also a lot of things that I can continue to learn on and so on. But it's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, Roy, thank you so much. And we're delighted to have you back here. I can definitely say that for such a powerful, thoughtful and reflective expression of your experience over a number of years where, in fact, I think your career trajectory, as you've just described it, mirrors many broader trajectories in international development. So it's absolutely fascinating to hear you tell that story. And I was sure before I heard it that it was going to be inspiring. I have no doubt that everyone here in the room and also online will have been inspired by that. And I'm sure we'll have many questions. So we'll open up for questions in just a moment. Gary will come around with the microphone, and also online, if you have any questions that you'd like to put in the chat, Gary will also try to pick out a few of those and to share those with us. I mean, just to pick up a few of the things, Roy, that you've just shared with us. I mean, I think obviously you've shared a number of experiences in different contexts of development in Africa, Asia, the Pacific region, the Caucasus. So, I think you've given that sense of breadth about a range of different contexts where you at first hand have experienced different kinds of processes which, come under this broad label called development. You've described people that you've met and you've known, some of whom sadly are no longer with us, but whose leadership has so strongly influenced so many lives, and clearly yours as well, which is really impressive. I think you've given us some fascinating insights into politics and policy, with your times with the Labour Party, with the civil service, with international NGOs, with the UN. So again, you've got that breadth of experience with a range of different agencies and different types of organization. And I think what's particularly special from what I've just, heard you describe, your understanding of different qualities of leadership. You've talked a lot about inclusion and relationships, the importance of bringing people on side of teams, of coalitions, collective efforts, and understanding the complementarities that different people bring. You've talked about strategy, the dangers sometimes that we may invest too much hope in the strategy and need to understand how we connect the big picture to the specific needs of a context. You've talked about adaptability, from bicycles to cars to a range of other modes of transport, but also working in different languages. And I think that was a very powerful point, that ability to connect, the importance of clarity and communication, which I think you've just demonstrated perfectly. And also something that really struck me is your emphasis on readiness and willingness to learn, to understand how you learn, but also how those around you also learn, so that you can really build on the strengths and different ways that people bring to their lives and the kinds of experiences. And I think the last thing that I've really taken with that is your emphasis, which you have really demonstrated, on respect and humility. I really appreciate sharing the breadth of your experience in a way which is not promoting yourself, but sharing lessons that you've learned along the way. And I think that's tremendous. And I've also learned the meaning of discretionary effort. So when Melissa calls me at 3 a.m, I'll just go back to sleep. Thank you, Roy. It was really a tremendous set of experiences, and we'll open up now to questions. Maybe I can just ask you one quick question. I'm aware that whilst in Papua New Guinea, you were involved in creating a video called Driving the Change. And actually that video won an award because of the quality. And it focused on connecting the global goals with how development processes are experienced at the local level in Papua New Guinea. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you approach that? Because I think one question that often arises is, how do you make the connection between what's happening in very particular sets of circumstances and context to that bigger picture that you talked about earlier?
Yeah. Peter, so this was 2017 when we made this film called Driving the Change. It's on YouTube and so on. You can see it. The photography is phenomenal. And so I had this idea that we had these global goals, but nobody in Papua New Guinea, in the villages, knew anything about what these global goals were, what connection there was. They just thought, well, that's something for the UN or for governments to think about, etc. It's not for us, surely. And so I talked to a film crew from the local TV, and I said, I want to make this film. Can you help me? And fortunately, the producer, Marco, said to me, okay, we'll do that, but we have very little time. Okay, so we can only probably film for 3 days. And so they said to us, well, where should we go to film? What should we film? And we said to them, okay, go for 3 days up to the highlands of Papua New Guinea and film in some of these villages where we're trying to talk to people about what these sustainable development goals are. And so the film crew went up there, and on a Friday morning, they arrived back on the Sunday night, and they said to me, whoa, we've got some really amazing film. I didn't know what they'd filmed, by the way. And but we got a lot of questions to ask you. So on the Monday, can you come and sit in this chair? And so I sat in a chair, and they said, we've got a lot of questions. So they had been to see a community that was trying to implement some of what is in the Sustainable Development Goals, their own interpretation, local interpretation of the SDGs. And the photographer has spliced together this phenomenal, lovely, beautiful photography with, my explanation of what I think is happening in this community and so on. And that film won the best award in the category of humanity, best TV film documentary on the theme of humanity in 2017. It's a beautiful film that actually shows that these sustainable development goals are not just something that happens, in these big meeting halls, etc. They actually make people's lives. They influence people's lives and the choices and so on. And it's their interpretation, the community's interpretation. So it was a really lovely thing, and it was shown in lots of different places. And we used it then as a basis for conversations about international development and so on. And tried to close the gap between all these international development practitioners and institutions and the government and the people of Papua New Guinea.
Hey, thanks, Roy. And I think it shows another quality of leadership is that openness and willingness to use new forms of communication and different forms of connecting people as new technologies become available to us as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up. Perhaps we can start by taking maybe 3 questions from the floor. Michelle has the roving mic. I can see Richard ready, and then we'll invite 2 more. And then perhaps after that, Gary, we can have a round from...
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about how you found the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, in practice in relation to community action.
Thanks, Richard. Shall we take another couple more in the room? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your inspiring presentations. My question is that, is there any time in your career that you find that you feel disappointed that what you learn in IDS or in the school doesn't match the reality? And how do you face it, if you have any? Thank you.
Would you just like to tell us your name as well?
Oh, sorry, I'm Juni. I'm a student in IDS. I'm from Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. It was quite inspiring and covered many years and many episodes. I want to ask you, because you did actually cover from about 40 years, from sort of NGOs to civil service to political to many to government. Like, really, how much is changing? In a sense, we have the language from 40 years ago, 30, we can talk from 35 years ago. So yes, there's a whole new language. There's a whole new thing now, way of sort of looking at certain things. We talk about the localization. We talk about the funding, the donors. In reality, we've got the language down. We've got things different. But really, how much is changing in terms of the leadership? Are things really just being packaged quite differently? Or are we really, in your opinion, do you really see the leadership actually going into new types of avenues to really different change rather than a repackaging of the same type of thing? And I just wanted to also add, in terms of the discourse between humanitarian aid and development, we're now looking at countries years and years always fighting humanitarian crises and still talking about international development separately. So just in terms of that change as well, in terms of the leadership of different countries and obviously here, yeah, what's your opinion?
And just to share your name with us also.
Oh, sorry. My name is Carol Sherman. I'm a retired aid worker from back when you were.
Great, thanks. Maybe we'll just take 1 more at the back, Michelle, and then perhaps Roy. Is that okay, Roy? You can have the floor. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I am Jafet Omaye. I'm studying business and development at the business school. I heard about the lecture and I wanted to be here. Thank you, Mr. Roy, for such an interesting sharing of experiences. I have 2 questions. The first one is, I want to understand, in the course of your work, did you have interface with multinationals across the places that you worked that are not actually maybe government owned? So how were you able to establish relationship with some of them? And then how were you able to sustain your work working with some multinationals across the places you've worked? The second one is related to maybe a little bit private, but if it's fine by you, you could provide some responses to it. How were you able to have a balance between your private life, probably your family, and then juggling through all of the work that you have to do over these years? Thank you.
Great, thanks. And remember, this is being recorded. And then, so Roy, if you could respond to those, and then Gary will come for questions from online.
Firstly, Richard's question about SDGs and community action. I think when the SDGs were first formulated, of course, we had the MDGs first, the 8 MDGs, the SDGs from 2015. And initially, I think all of us were thinking, how will we possibly make this connection between, this big, all these grand ideas, etc., in people's lives? But I think for me, and the film Driving the Change tried to do that, is try to bring those things a bit closer together so that people could see, 17 goals. Okay, what are the ways in which they're connected? I think the SDGs are not understood very well. So Richard, I don't know if you agree with me. There's still a very much compartmentalization, and people don't always see that sometimes, if you're interested in education, you might have to start on the water and security goal. You might have to start on peace and security, and gradually also link up to the goals that you are particularly connected with. But the links between community action and SDGs, I think, have strengthened from 2015. And I think that now there is slightly better understanding amongst many governments and so on, but there's a long way to go still. Okay, that's my short answer to that. In terms of Julie's question about any disappointments about what I learned at IDS, I would say, Julie, I was not disappointed because the thing that IDS taught me was always to be curious, always to be inquisitive. But not everything I learned at IDS could be applied. And when I got, for example, to Papua New Guinea, and I was schooled in most of my experience is in the UK, in South Asia, and in Africa. And we always tried to build the role of the state and make people, the social contract and so on. And I got to Papua New Guinea, and most people in Papua New Guinea didn't see it that way. Their allegiance was to their clan. And the reason was very basic, because since Papua New Guinea's independence, what had the central state done? It had given license after license to mining operations, etc. And local people felt they didn't benefit. So I had to relearn some of what I'd learned at IDS about how do you make people feel part of something bigger? And then how do you perhaps work with local government or state governments, and then gradually try and work into a federal system. So I had to rethink a lot of my thinking and what I was taught at IDS. But I never was disappointed because, part of the reason why I kept in touch with IDS because I learned so many things here from so many amazing teachers and so on. And I know that I mentioned many names, and I didn't mention many names as well of people who taught here. Okay, and some of those people might think, oh, you didn't miss me out. I can tell you that we really learned a lot of amazing stuff, but it's too long a list to mention. There are too many amazing teachers that we've had at IDS over the years. How is Carol's really fascinating questions about, well, what is actually changing? And I have to say, Carol, particularly this whole climate crisis is making me rethink about some of these things. But I think some of the things that are changing, in my view, particularly during the COVID period, in Timor-Leste, which is a very small nation, for the best part of 2 years, the international community, many aid agencies just left the country because they couldn't guarantee their own safety of their workers. And so government was left there by themselves. The UN system did stay behind. I was there throughout and so on. And the thing that I saw which was changing was much more awareness, much more capacity at local level. And when I travel in Malawi, for example, where I've been several times since I left from my first experience there, or if I travel to parts of India, and you see the capacity, local capacity is phenomenal now, okay? And I think that is something which is really amazing. There is a fantastic study many years ago done by Stan and Mary from India who came to look at the UK National Health Service in the 1990s. And Stan and Mary did an amazing thing around, people who were being invited here from India to come and work in the health service, and what could the health service and vulnerability you could learn here. And it kind of shows you that actually there is so much capacity in a lot of these countries now that it's not just people coming to train here. Yes, there are things that people can come to IDS and learn, but there are equally many things that the UK can learn from things going on all over the world, from Brazil, from any country in the world. I can tell you there's a lot. And I think one of the things that if we do a 60th anniversary set of lectures on what's changing in development and the relevance of development is around bringing some of that experience back into post-industrialized societies, etc.
Yeah.
The issues around humanitarian and development, I think that thing is closing. I did some work recently in the Pacific on the Samoa pathway in the last 10 years. And again, that link between humanitarian and many more humanitarian work is going on without international support. I can tell you, there's, the first responders are always national people, usually the faith-based groups, etc. Yes, there are others, the International Red Cross, the UN system, everybody else, the NGOs, etc., come in later. But actually, there's a lot of things. But this scope better than as well as me, I'm sure. So I think that it is something worth striving for. And those who are students here, it is really worth your while, no matter whether you go into humanitarian work or development, but try to understand and also get experience of other things. Because when the first time I dealt with humanitarian work was in India, and just people being displaced, etc. It's going to become a bigger part of our agenda, partly because of climate change, displacement, etc. is becoming, a migration is becoming a much bigger thing. So try to understand how should you work in those different types of contexts. The question from Shofi, I think, about multinationals, my experience has been mixed, I would say. So there were places where we tried to work with big philanthropy. We worked also with multinationals, including in Papua New Guinea with some oil and gas companies to try and get them to do more in the local areas where they were working. And some of them were willing to do things and so on. One of the things I did with the Business Council of Papua New Guinea is help set up an SDG. It was basically SDG monitor for businesses to say how were businesses contributing? Are they contributing to the SDGs? And the Business Council of Papua New Guinea initially was very skeptical about it. But once they set it up, they said, we finally got a question, an answer to the question that the Prime Minister keeps posing to us. The Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea kept asking the private sector, well, other than jobs, what are you doing to help me with development of my country? And they didn't have a good answer. And then finally, when they were able to make the connection with some of the sustainable development goals through things like energy, efficiency, etc., they were able to start to answer some of that question. But it's mixed. And certainly not every multinational will do, some of what they'll do will be to continue their work, but to make sort of small, support development in smaller ways, but you have to find a way of engaging with them. And then the final question on private life. Look, I think that I've been very fortunate. I've been very fortunate because I've had a partner that supported me. I remember when I was at IDS, Emmanuel, Richard Longhurst, so Richard were here as well at that time. I could not afford to live in Brighton. I was one of those guys who got a bursary for my MPhil course, but I was living in London with my partner. My partner supported me to do my MPhil. We married years later in 1992. We have 3 children. We're very happy and so on. But actually, a lot of the time I've had to spend away from my family. And so, you have to definitely make compromises. But let me tell you one thing that should stay with all development workers. First and foremost, beside your work, etc., love to be with your people who love you. They are the most important people in your lives. They are the people who will tell you to look after your mental health, to look after your physical health. Everything else can come after that. Your employers will rarely tell you, rarely tell you, although there's much more work now on, looking after your mental health and your physical health and so on. Look after the people you love, okay? And that stayed with me also, because there was a time when I could have gone into politics, etc. And I saw that for most political leaders, their private lives were really messy. And I didn't want that. So anyway, that's the compromise I made. I'm not saying it's right for everybody. Everybody is different. But my advice to you is definitely look after the people that love you the most and that you love the most. That's the most significant thing.
Great, thanks, Roy. That's very sage advice indeed. Gary, time is running short, but I don't know whether you have a quick, perhaps just to share one or two quick questions.
Okay, this is from Amira. As a member of Parliament who got a master's from IDS, if you had one core advice for a policymaker who studied development, what would it be? So what one piece of advice would you give to a policymaker who studied development? And this is from Susan Fleck. What advice do you have about how to what advice do you have about how to disagree and work through conflict? In Malawi, you could agree to changing a book title, but could you tell us about a time you had to make a stand?
Sure. So very quickly on those two, and Susan, by the way, was on our MPhil course. It's amazing that she's able to dial in today. Let me start with that first question, which was the policymakers. And, I think the most important thing is be with the people. My advice is go to the people that you're serving, try and find out what are the challenges that they're facing. Think about what can you do to help them. And outsiders can't always bring about all the changes that to help people's lives, but even just to be in solidarity with people, to try and help to think through how can you support people better. There are people in the UK at the moment and across the world who are struggling with food crisis. Think about, energy crisis. We've got a multitude of different crises. Think about what you can do as a policymaker, even though it might be small steps to try and support them better, etc. On Susan's question about when did you have to make a stand, I think for me, one of the important things, and in Timor and during the COVID pandemic, we had to make certain stands at certain times to say, actually, yes, we can do certain things for you, etc. There was also questions when in human rights work, for example, in Papua New Guinea, when I was there were several students who were shot for protesting. And I had to be the one from the development community who had to go and tell the press, the media, the prime minister, and political leaders this wasn't right. And so, but you can do that when you have a good relationship with somebody, they will listen to you. If you always criticize somebody and then you have to make a stand, it's much more difficult. If you can find ways in which you're saying, well, I'm a friend of this country, I want this country to do the best for the people in this country and for the world, then people will listen to you. And I think, fortunately, when I was critical of government, people said, yeah, actually, maybe he's right about some of the things. Our police shouldn't have shot those people. And we have to be more careful with arms and so on. So I think you have to learn to make a stand of certain things. And in the same way that I tried with President Banda, which wasn't easy, I didn't say to him, you're right, Mr. President, there is no such thing as poverty. I said to him, well, Mr. President, this is what people are telling us. They're telling us that they're living in poverty. But if you feel that there is no poverty, fine. I can change the title of the book. It's much more important that we are here to serve your people and to work with you to try and improve the lives of people. So that's the way I rationalized it to myself and so on. Whether that was the right thing at the time, I don't know, but that's the way I did it.
Great, Roy. Thank you so much. Time is sort of beating us for more questions in the session, but we're drawing to an end. Not quite ended yet, so I'll ask those online still to stay with us for a few minutes, and those in the room. Those who are in the room will be able to join for a few minutes, for a little while afterwards. We've got some refreshments here. We're sorry if those online can't partake of those, but we know you'll be with us in spirit. Roy, I would just like to say you've given us so much food for thought. I'm already now thinking about IDS's 60th anniversary dialogue about development and development studies, and I'm sure, Roy, will definitely be calling you for your sage advice and thoughts and reflections, along with many others who've been part of the IDS community and remain so over such a long period of time. So before we move to the final part of the session, so please, we're not quite stopping yet, but let me use this opportunity, Roy, to thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. I really appreciate it. And now, as we move towards the end of this event, we'd just like to highlight that not only have Dudley Seers, Sir Hans Singer, and Sir Richard Jolly helped shape global development thinking and IDS as an institute, they are also significant contributors to the IDS Graduate Scholarship Program via the Seers Singer Jolly Fund. And our graduate scholarship program opens the door for talented individuals from low and middle income countries who, like these three leaders, are committed to bringing about positive social change. And the Seers Singer Jolly Fund is open to gifts from IDS alumni and friends of IDS, and the fund will continue to support new generations of informed and knowledgeable leaders and champions to help respond to the global challenges that we face. So if you're interested in providing support, please visit our website, www.ids.ac.uk/scholarships for more information and to give online. And you can also speak to Michelle over here at any time about other ways to support IDS. And Gary, I think you are now going to show us a short film as we close our session. Great. Thanks. So on that inspiring note, what's also really nice to see is that, you know, IDS is a community that just keeps going. I can see out of the corner of my eye in the chat that there are those on the chat who are actually communicating with each other and saying hello, as well as I can see out of the corner of my giving great appreciation for your talk, Roy. So these conversations will continue. It's a great joy to bring everybody together in a physical space. We've missed this during the time of the pandemic. Thank you to all of those who've joined us online. Thank you for those who've come here today. And most particularly, thank you, Roy, for sharing your thoughts with us.